His dying words echoed through 3 generations of the Collins family. When the oak tree reaches its 100th year, dig beneath its roots. For 45 years, they honored old Jacob Collins' puzzling final wish, protecting the ancient oak that stood sentinel on the eastern hill. Through bitter winters, summer droughts, and financial hardships that nearly cost them the farm, the promise remained unbroken. Now, as Eliza Collins watched her young children carefully excavate the soil around the massive roots on the oak's centennial spring, her heart pounding with anticipation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The secret they unearthed would transform not just their struggling farm, but reveal a legacy of foresight that would ripple through their small community for generations to come. The massive oak tree cast long shadows across the Collins family farmstead as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon. Located in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, Whispering Pines Farm had seen 4 generations of Collins farmers work its soil. The once prosperous dairy operation had fallen on hard times in recent years, with modernization costs and corporate competition pushing the family to the brink of selling their ancestral land. Eliza Collins pulled her worn denim jacket tighter against the early April chill as she made her way up the gentle slope toward the oak. Her children, 12-year-old Mason and 10-year-old Lily, raced ahead, their excitement palpable in the morning mist. Today was no ordinary day. It marked exactly 100 years since her great-grandfather Jacob Collins had planted the oak sapling on this very hill. "Mom, we brought the shovels just like you said," Lily called back, her chestnut hair, the same shade as old Jacob's in the faded photographs, bouncing as she ran. Eliza smiled despite the weight of responsibility that had settled on her shoulders since her father's passing last winter. He had been the keeper of the family's unusual promise, meticulously tracking the oak's growth and protecting it with a devotion that sometimes bordered on obsession. Now that duty had fallen to her, along with a struggling farm and mounting debts. "Remember what Grandpa always said," Mason recited solemnly as they reached the massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like arthritic fingers. "The oak holds the key." The oak had indeed become central to family lore. Stories of old Jacob and his mysterious final request had been passed down through generations, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said he'd been a secret investor who'd hidden his fortune. Others whispered about treasure buried during Prohibition. The children had grown up hearing these tales at family gatherings, watching as adults debated what might lie beneath the oak's spreading roots. Eliza ran her, and along the rough bark, feeling the history beneath her fingertips. The tree had witnessed everything, her father's childhood games, her own wedding beneath its branches, and now, perhaps, the revelation of its long-kept secret. Your great-great-grandfather Jacob was on his deathbed in the spring of 1978. Eliza began, repeating the story the children had heard countless times. He called your great-grandfather William to his side and made him promise that the oak sapling he'd planted would remain untouched until it reached 100 years. "When the oak reaches its 100th year, dig beneath its roots," he said. "Not before, not after, exactly 100 years. The specificity of the timing had always puzzled the family. Why 100 years? What was so significant about this particular tree? Old Jacob had been known throughout Hayfield County as a man of unusual foresight, having preserved the family farm through the Great Depression when neighboring properties failed. He'd introduced sustainable farming practices decades before. They became common and kept meticulous records of weather patterns, crop yields, and soil conditions in leather-bound journals that still sat in the farmhouse study. Dad said there was something in the way great-great-grandpa Jacob looked at him that day, Eliza continued, setting down her own shovel. A certainty that whatever was beneath this tree would be worth the wait. That promise had been tested repeatedly. Over the decades, In the 1990s, a severe storm had damaged part of the oak, but rather than cutting the injured limb, Eliza's grandfather had hired a specialist to save it. During the drought of 2012, precious water had been diverted to keep the oak alive while crops withered. Most recently, when developers offered to buy the eastern section of the farm, including the hilltop where the oak stood, for a price that would have solved all their financial troubles, Eliza's father had flatly refused. The oak stays in the family, he had insisted, even as the bank threatened foreclosure. Mason knelt by the massive trunk, examining the soil. Where exactly are we supposed to dig? The roots go out really far. Great-grandpa's journal said Jacob was specific about that too. Eliza pulled a weathered notebook from her jacket pocket. He said to measure 5 feet due north from the trunk and dig down 3 feet. The children looked at each other with wide eyes. This wasn't just one of their pretend treasure hunts. This was real family history unfolding. What if there's nothing there? Lily asked softly, giving voice to the doubt that had lingered at the edges of family discussions for generations. Eliza knelt beside her daughter. Then we'll have honored our promise, just as those before us did. That's what matters most. But privately, Eliza needed there to be something, anything, that might help save the farm. The foreclosure notice had arrived last week, giving them 30 days to make payment. The oak centennial had come just in time, or perhaps too late. Let's find out what old Jacob wanted us to know, she said, standing and positioning her compass. She measured carefully from the trunk, marking the spot with a small flag. Here, this is where we dig. As the morning sun rose higher, casting dappled light through the oak's new spring leaves, the Collins family began to carefully remove the soil, layer by layer. Eliza insisted they dig slowly, mindful of the tree's roots and whatever might be buried below. The children worked with surprising patience, their usual energy channeled into methodical digging. Every few inches they would pause, brushing away soil with small brushes Eliza had brought from her garden shed. "I hit something," Mason suddenly exclaimed as his shovel made a dull metallic sound about 2 feet down. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. After 45 years of waiting, the moment had arrived. Whatever lay beneath the ancient oak was about to change everything, for better or worse. The discovery beneath the oak tree was both simpler and more complex than the Collins family had imagined. As Mason and Lily carefully brushed away the last layer of soil, they revealed not gold coins or buried treasure, but a peculiar metal container roughly the size of a small suitcase. Made of what appeared to be stainless steel, it showed remarkably little corrosion, despite its long interment. "It looks like a time capsule," Eliza breathed, her fingers tracing the Collins family crest that had been etched into the metal surface. "Your father had one just like this in his study, but smaller." The container was secured with a combination lock, its dial still turning smoothly after nearly half a century underground. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she consulted the final page of her father's journal, where he had recorded a series of numbers that had previously meant nothing to her. "It must be the combination," she murmured, turning the dial carefully. 4/1878, April 18th, 1978, the day great-great-grandpa Jacob died. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The children crowded closer as Eliza lifted the lid, revealing the contents that old Jacob Collins had deemed important enough to preserve for a century. Inside, meticulously organized and sealed in vacuum-packed containers, lay several leather-bound journals, similar to those the family had always kept, but much older. Beneath these were folders of documents, maps of the farm with extensive notations, and several small specimen jars containing what looked like seeds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most curious of all was a sealed envelope with "For my descendants, 2023, written in faded ink. "Is this it?" Mason asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. "Just a bunch of old papers." Eliza lifted out the letter, feeling the weight of history in her hands. "Your great-grandfather used to say that knowledge was more valuable than gold. Let's see what old Jacob wanted us to know." Breaking the seal with care, she unfolded several pages of yellowed paper covered in neat, precise handwriting. As she began to read aloud, old Jacob's voice seemed to reach across the decades. "To my family, who had the patience to honor an old man's request, if you are reading this, then the oak has reached its centennial, and you have kept faith with a promise made long ago. For this, I thank you. What I have left you is not treasure in the conventional sense, though I believe it will prove more valuable than gold or jewels in the world you now inhabit. In my lifetime, I have watched our land change. I have studied patterns in soil, weather, and crops that few others noticed. What I observed troubled me deeply, for I saw changes coming that would transform agriculture in ways my contemporaries could not imagine." Eliza paused, her voice catching as she realized the significance of what she was reading. He was documenting climate change in the 1970s. "What's climate change?" Lily asked, peering at the ancient handwriting. "It's the way weather patterns shift over time," Eliza explained, scanning ahead in the letter. "But what's remarkable is that great-great-grandpa was tracking these changes long before scientists were widely discussing them." She continued reading, her excitement growing with each paragraph. Old Jacob had been no ordinary farmer. Through decades of meticulous observation, he had identified shifts in growing seasons, rainfall patterns, and soil conditions. More importantly, he had developed and documented specialized farming techniques, adapted for the changing conditions he predicted would emerge by the oak's centennial year. "I have selected and preserved heirloom seed varieties that will thrive in the warmer, more volatile conditions I foresee for our region," the letter continued. "The accompanying journals document my experiments with drought-resistant cultivation methods, water conservation systems, and soil regeneration techniques that will become essential in your time. Most valuable, perhaps, are the detailed surveys I conducted of the eastern water table beneath our land. While my neighbors believed this hillside worthless for farming, my measurements indicated a substantial aquifer that will become increasingly valuable as surface water grows scarcer. The oak's roots have been mapping this resource for you over the century of its growth." Mason and Lily exchanged puzzled glances, not fully comprehending the significance of these revelations, but Eliza's mind was racing. The eastern section of their property, the very land developers had been so eager to purchase, sat atop a water source that would be invaluable in an era of increasing droughts. "There's more," she said, turning to the final pages. "He's left specific instructions for a sustainable irrigation system that utilizes the aquifer without depleting it." As she continued to examine the container's contents, the full scope of Jacob Collins' foresight began to emerge. His journals contained detailed agricultural innovations, crop rotation systems designed for changing growing seasons, natural pest management techniques for new insect species moving into warming climates, and building designs for weathering more extreme storms. "Mom, look at this," Mason said, carefully opening one of the specimen jars. "The seeds are labeled with the years they should be planted." Indeed, each jar contained different seed varieties, with specific instructions for cultivation and the optimal planting years, many labeled for 2023, 2024, and 2025. He wasn't just preserving seeds, Eliza realized. He was timing their introduction to coincide with the conditions he predicted would exist now. The maps revealed another level of planning. Old Jacob had mapped out watershed patterns, soil composition changes, and even wind corridors across the farm. He had effectively created a comprehensive agricultural plan designed specifically for the climate conditions of the 2020s, based on trends he had observed decades earlier. "This is why the timing was so specific," Eliza said, wonder in her voice. "He needed the oak to reach maturity to confirm his theories. The tree itself was part of the experiment. Its growth patterns, root system, and response to changing conditions were data points in his research." She remembered the countless times her father and grandfather had documented the oak's growth, taking soil samples around its base and photographing its seasonal changes. They hadn't just been monitoring a beloved tree, they had been continuing Jacob's long-term study without fully understanding its purpose. As morning turned to afternoon, the Collins family carefully transferred the precious contents to the farmhouse. Spread across the kitchen table, where generations of Collins farmers had made their plans and faced their challenges, old Jacob's legacy began to take on new meaning. "He didn't just leave us farming techniques," Eliza said, as she gently organized the journals by date. "He left us a way to save the farm." The children, initially disappointed by the lack of conventional treasure, had grown quiet as they leafed through the materials, the weight of their inheritance beginning to register even in their young minds. "So great-great-grandpa Jacob could tell the future?" Lily asked, wide-eyed. Eliza smiled, touching a page where Jacob had predicted the exact year when traditional corn varieties would begin to fail in their region, 2018, the first year they'd had a crop collapse. "Not exactly, sweetheart. He was just paying very close attention to the world around him, and he cared enough about us, about people he would never meet, to leave us what we would need." The days following the discovery beneath the oak tree transformed the Collins farmhouse into a war room of sorts. Eliza cleared the dining room table, spreading out Jacob's journals and maps in chronological order. Mason and Lily, captivated by their great-great-grandfather's meticulous drawings and notes, spent hours poring over the materials, asking questions that Eliza could only partially answer. "I need help understanding all of this," Eliza admitted on the third evening, rubbing her tired eyes. Despite her agricultural science degree, some of Jacob's observations and techniques were beyond her immediate comprehension. His integration of meteorological data, soil chemistry, and botanical adaptations represented a lifetime of learning and insight. The following morning, she made two important calls. The first was to Dr. Eleanor Hayes, her former professor from Penn State's College of Agricultural Sciences. The second was to her cousin Michael, a hydrologist with the State Environmental Agency who specialized in groundwater resources. Is saying your great-great-grandfather documented climate patterns starting in the 1940s? Dr. Hayes asked skeptically when she arrived at the farmhouse that weekend. A tall woman in her 60s, with silver hair and practical outdoor clothing, she'd been interested enough in Eliza's vague description to drive 2 hours from the university. "See for yourself," Eliza said, directing her to the earliest journals. The professor's skepticism melted as she examined Jacob's records. His early entries documented subtle shifts in first and last frost dates, changing migration patterns of birds, and variations in insect populations that most farmers of his era would have ignored. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Hayes murmured, carefully turning pages filled with temperature recordings, precipitation measurements, and soil analyses spanning decades. He was identifying microclimate changes years before we had the terminology for them, and these adaptive farming techniques, some of these are approaches we're only now beginning to implement in sustainable agriculture programs. Michael arrived the following day, immediately drawn to Jacob's hydrological surveys. Using modern equipment, he confirmed what the old farmer had discovered through more primitive means. A substantial aquifer lay beneath the eastern section of the property, largely untapped and naturally filtered through layers of limestone. Your great-great-grandfather was right, Michael said, comparing his readings with Jacob's hand-drawn maps. This water source could sustainably irrigate your entire farm through even severe drought conditions if properly managed. The way he designed this extraction system minimizes depletion while maximizing flow rate. He looked up from the papers, his expression serious. Eliza, do you realize what this means? Water rights in this region are becoming increasingly valuable. Those developers weren't after your land for housing. They most likely had data suggesting this aquifer existed. This revelation hit Eliza like a physical blow. The seemingly generous offer that had tempted her in recent months suddenly appeared predatory. Jacob Collins had foreseen not just environmental changes, but the resulting economic implications. By the end of the week, the farmhouse had become a hub of activity. Dr. Hayes brought in 2 graduate students to help catalogue Jacob's agricultural innovations. Michael began mapping the aquifer using modern technology, confirming the accuracy of the century-old predictions. Most surprisingly, several of Jacob's seed specimens proved viable when tested in the university's lab. These are drought-resistant variants of heritage crops, Dr. Hayes explained, showing Eliza the preliminary germination results. He seems to have been selectively breeding for resilience to precisely the conditions we're experiencing now. Some of these varieties don't exist in our current seed banks. The scientific validation of Jacob's work was gratifying, but Eliza's most pressing concern remained the farm's imminent foreclosure. With only 3 weeks remaining before the bank deadline, she needed to translate this unexpected inheritance into financial salvation. The answer came from an unexpected source. During dinner one evening, Lily looked up from one of the journals she'd been examining. "Mom, did you see these drawings? Great-great-grandpa made plans for weird-looking greenhouses." She pushed the open journal across the table, revealing detailed sketches of rounded, partially subterranean structures designed to maintain stable growing conditions with minimal energy input. Dr. Hayes examined the designs with growing excitement. These are passive solar growing systems, calibrated specifically for your farm's topography and the climate conditions Jacob predicted for this time period. They utilize thermal mass principles that weren't widely applied in agriculture until decades after he developed these plans. "Could we actually build them?" Eliza asked, hope flickering for the first time since the foreclosure notice arrived. "Not only could you build them, but they would qualify for several substantial sustainability grants," Dr. Hayes replied. The integration of historical agricultural knowledge with climate adaptation measures would make this project highly attractive to funding agencies. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Eliza sat alone on the farmhouse porch, looking out toward the oak trees silhouetted against the starry sky. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Jacob's legacy was not simply information, it was a blueprint for transforming the struggling Collins farm into a model of climate-adaptive agriculture. The following morning brought Michael with news that crystallized their path forward. After consulting with colleagues at the Environmental Agency, he confirmed that the aquifer beneath the property could be legally registered as a protected water resource, with the Collins family retaining primary usage rights. Furthermore, he added, the state has a new initiative to secure water resources for agricultural sustainability. They're offering conservation easements that would pay you to maintain the land over the aquifer in its natural state while allowing you to implement sustainable irrigation for your crops. The conservation easement alone would provide enough immediate capital to resolve the bank loan crisis. Combined with the agricultural innovation grants Dr. Hayes was helping them apply for, the Collins farm had a fighting chance, not just at survival, but at becoming a pioneer in climate-adaptive farming. As word spread through academic and agricultural circles about Jacob Collins' remarkable foresight, The farm began receiving visitors, agricultural historians, climate scientists, and sustainable farming advocates, all eager to examine his work. What had been a private family mystery was evolving into something with far broader implications. Eliza established strict protocols for access to Jacob's materials, working with the university to properly preserve and digitize his records while maintaining the family's control over his innovations. The Collins family legacy, it seemed, would extend far beyond their own farm. 2 weeks after the discovery beneath the oak tree, Eliza sat with Mason and Lily at the kitchen table, explaining what all this would mean for their future. The farm isn't just saved, she told them. It's going to change, just as great-great-grandpa Jacob knew it would need to. We're going to build those special greenhouses, implement his water management system, and plant his specially preserved seeds. Our farm is going to help show others how to adapt to the changing climate. So we're going to be famous? Mason asked. Eyes wide, Eliza smiled. Maybe not famous, but we're going to be part of something important. Great-great-grandpa Jacob didn't just leave us a way to save our farm. He left us a purpose. Lily looked thoughtful. Do you think he knew we'd be the ones to dig up his box? That it would be us, specifically? I don't know, Eliza admitted. But I think he understood something important. That family means caring for people you'll never meet. He cared about us without knowing exactly who we'd be, just as we need to care about those who will come after us. As they spoke, through the kitchen window, the ancient oak stood tall against the setting sun, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, a living monument to a farmer who had seen beyond his own horizon. Jacob Collins had not been an ordinary farmer, and as the family delved deeper into his journals, the remarkable scope of his life emerged with growing clarity. Born in 1898 to humble Pennsylvania farmers, Jacob had shown an early aptitude for observation and analysis that set him apart from his peers. His formal education had ended with 8th grade, but his self-directed learning continued throughout his life. The journals revealed that Jacob had served briefly in World War I, where he was assigned to an agricultural support unit in France due to his farming background. This unexpected deployment had exposed him to European agricultural practices and broadened his worldview significantly. More importantly, it had introduced him to meteorological science through a chance friendship with a weather officer who recognized Jacob's natural abilities. Look at these entries from 1919, Dr. Hayes pointed out to Eliza one afternoon. He's already beginning to correlate weather patterns with crop outcomes in ways that were decades ahead of standard practice. After returning from Europe, Jacob had used his modest veteran's payment to purchase what would become the Collins family farm, 200 acres of land considered marginal by his contemporaries due to its varied topography and soil composition. Where others saw limitations, Jacob had recognized opportunity. The 1920s sections of his journals detailed methodical experiments with crop placement, utilizing different microclimates across the property to maximize yields. During the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, when neighboring farms struggled catastrophically, Jacob's diversified approach and early implementation of soil conservation techniques had kept his land productive. Your great-great-grandfather was practicing sustainable agriculture before the term existed, Dr. Hayes explained to Mason and Lily, who had developed a surprising interest in their ancestors' story. He understood the relationship between soil health, water management, and long-term productivity, when most farmers were focused solely on immediate yields. Photographs preserved in the journals showed Jacob as a lean, serious-faced man with penetrating eyes and work-weathered hands. In most images, he stood slightly apart from others at community gatherings, suggesting a certain reserve that aligned with family stories about his thoughtful, somewhat solitary nature. That's definitely Lily's thinking face, Mason teased, pointing to a particularly intense expression in one photograph where Jacob examined a soil sample. Jacob's most formative experiences appeared to have come during the post-World War II period. His journals from the late 1940s recorded his growing concern about changing weather patterns and their potential impact on agriculture. Unlike most farmers who viewed unusual weather as temporary aberrations, Jacob had begun methodically tracking deviations from historical norms. He was creating baseline data, Michael explained as he examined Jacob's handcrafted weather station. Designs. Most climate science struggles because we lack consistent long-term measurements from before industrialization. Your great-great-grandfather was essentially building his own climate record. The personal aspects of Jacob's life were less thoroughly documented than his scientific observations, but occasional entries offered glimpses of the man behind the meticulous records. He had married relatively late, at age 37, to a local schoolteacher named Margaret, who shared his intellectual curiosity, if not his scientific bent. Their partnership had produced 3 children, including Eliza's great-grandfather William, born in 1943. "I've explained to William my concerns about the changes I've observed," Jacob wrote in 1952. "At 9 years old, he listens more carefully than most grown men. Perhaps he will continue this work when I no longer can." By the late 1950s, Jacob's journals showed his growing certainty that significant climate shifts were occurring, decades before such ideas gained scientific consensus. His farming adaptations became increasingly forward-looking, breeding crop varieties for conditions he anticipated rather than those he currently faced. What truly distinguished Jacob from other observant farmers was his systematic approach to anticipating change. Beginning in the early 1960s, he had developed mathematical models to project how slight annual temperature increases would compound over decades. These calculations, remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal scientific training, had led to his stark conclusions about the farming conditions his descendants would face. He was essentially doing climate modeling with pencil and paper, said one of Dr. Hayes's graduate students with undisguised admiration. The most striking thing is how closely his projections align with what we now know has occurred. The 1970s entries, written as Jacob entered his final years, revealed his growing sense of urgency. He had begun the Oak Tree Project as a living experiment, a way to track soil and climate changes while creating a time capsule for future generations. The specific 100-year timeline had been calculated based on when he believed his adaptations would become not just beneficial, but necessary for the farm's survival. "I plant this oak not for myself, nor even for my children, but for my great-grandchildren's children, who will need its lessons," he had written on the day he placed the sapling on the Eastern Hill in 1923. 55 years later, with his health failing, he had buried his research beneath the maturing tree, trusting that his descendants would honor his request. As fascinating as Jacob's scientific foresight was, Eliza found herself most moved by the personal messages interspersed throughout the technical data. Despite never knowing them, Jacob had written directly to future generations of his family with remarkable emotional insight. "To those who read these words," one such passage began, "I understand the sacrifice required to maintain an aging man's strange request through decades of uncertainty. Doubt is natural when the purpose remains hidden. Your faith in honoring this promise reveals character that would make any ancestor proud." For Eliza, these messages transformed Jacob from a distant historical figure into a present guide. His uncanny ability to anticipate not just environmental changes, but the psychological and economic pressures his family would face, lent his advice a weight that transcended the decades. Lily had taken to carrying a small notebook like her ancestor, recording her own observations about plants and weather in childish but earnest handwriting. Mason, meanwhile, had begun helping Michael with the aquifer surveys, showing an aptitude for the technical aspects of hydrology that surprised everyone. "It's in their blood," Dr. Hayes commented, watching the children engage with their heritage. In such tangible ways, the farm itself seemed to respond to the renewed attention and purpose. As spring advanced, Eliza implemented some of Jacob's early season planting recommendations, using several of his preserved seed varieties in test plots. The results were immediately noticeable: stronger germination rates and more vigorous early growth than the modern commercial varieties in adjacent fields. Local farmers, initially skeptical of the Collins family treasure story that had begun circulating through the community, grew curious when they saw the university researchers regularly visiting the property. Harold Wilson, whose farm bordered the Collins land to the west, stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to return a borrowed fence mender, but clearly fishing for information. "Heard you folks found something interesting under that old oak tree," he said casually, declining Eliza's offer of coffee, but settling into a kitchen chair nonetheless. Eliza shared a carefully edited version of their discovery, emphasizing Jacob's agricultural innovations without detailing the aquifer or the full extent of his climate predictions. Harold listened with growing interest. "Your great-granddaddy was always considered a bit strange," he admitted. "My grandfather used to say old Jacob was farming like he had a direct line to the Almighty's weather plans. Looks like maybe he was onto something after all." As April turned to May, the weight of Jacob's legacy settled into a new rhythm for the Collins family. The immediate financial crisis had been averted. The conservation easement papers were signed, and the first installment had satisfied the bank's most pressing demands. The grant applications for the innovative greenhouse designs were advancing through review with positive preliminary feedback. But beyond these practical concerns, something more profound had shifted. The farm was no longer simply land to be worked, or a business to be saved. It had become a mission spanning generations, a living laboratory for agricultural resilience in a changing world. "Do you think we're supposed to bury something for future generations?" Lily asked one evening as they walked up to visit the oak tree, now sprouting fresh green leaves in the lengthening spring days. Eliza smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. "I think that's exactly what great-great-grandpa Jacob would want us to do." As the Collins farm's immediate financial crisis eased, new challenges emerged that tested the family's commitment to Jacob's vision. The most pressing was the question of implementation. Transforming century-old innovations into modern agricultural practice required expertise, labor, and capital beyond what Eliza could personally manage. "These designs are brilliant in concept, but translating them into contemporary construction will require significant engineering adaptations," said Howard Mercer, the sustainable architecture consultant Dr. Hayes had recommended. A practical man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin and calculating eyes, he surveyed the eastern fields where Jacob had designated the greenhouse locations. "The passive heating principles are sound, but building codes have changed substantially since these were designed. We'll need to modify the structural elements while preserving the thermal dynamics." The preliminary cost estimates for the first phase of implementation were sobering: over $200,000 to build just 2 of the specialized growing structures and implement the initial water management system. The grants and easement funds would cover approximately 60% of these costs, leaving a substantial gap that concerned Eliza deeply. "We've solved the immediate crisis, but we're still walking a financial tightrope," she admitted to Michael during one of his regular visits to continue the aquifer mapping. "If these adaptations don't produce results quickly, we could end up right back where we started." There were also unexpected complications with Jacob's seed varieties. While many remained viable, their growing characteristics were significantly different from modern crops, requiring adjustments to planting schedules, spacing, and care techniques. "These aren't like contemporary commercial seeds," Dr. Hayes explained, as she examined the struggling test plots where some of Jacob's corn varieties were growing unevenly. They were developed for resilience over yield, diversity over uniformity. Modern farming equipment and techniques are designed around standardization that these heritage crops simply don't conform to. The labor-intensive nature of implementing Jacob's methods created another strain point. Eliza found herself working from dawn until well past dusk, trying to balance regular farm operations with the specialized attention the experimental crops required. Mason and Lily helped where they could, but they were still children with school responsibilities and their own activities. The strain began showing in small ways: missed meals, forgotten appointments, and increasing fatigue that left Eliza short-tempered at times. The children noticed, exchanging worried glances when their mother fell asleep at the kitchen table, reviewing construction estimates one evening. "Mom needs help," Mason said decisively to Lily later that night. "Great-great-grandpa Jacob didn't expect one person to do everything alone." The next morning, the children took action in their own way. Mason called a meeting of his 4-H club, explaining to his friends about the special growing methods they were implementing. Lily, meanwhile, created illustrated flyers about the Collins Farm Heritage Project and convinced her science teacher to make it a class project. Their initiative yielded unexpected results. By the weekend, a group of curious neighbors, 4-H members, and Lily's classmates with their parents had gathered at the farm, drawn by the children's enthusiasm and the increasingly well-known story of Jacob's foresight. Eliza found herself leading an impromptu tour of the test plots, explaining the principles behind Jacob's farming methods to an attentive audience. Howard Mercer had brought preliminary architectural renderings of the proposed greenhouses, which attracted particular interest from several local contractors. "These designs incorporate principles we're just now adopting in sustainable building," remarked Carol Winters, a green building specialist who had come at Howard's invitation. "The thermal mass calculations are particularly innovative." What had begun as a simple volunteer recruiting effort by the children evolved into something like a community fair. Dr. Hayes and her graduate students set up displays explaining the scientific significance of Jacob's work. Michael demonstrated the aquifer mapping techniques using simplified models that fascinated both children and adults. Most significantly, several local farmers who had initially dismissed the Collins family treasure story as exaggerated folklore began asking serious questions about the heritage seed varieties and water conservation techniques. Harold Wilson, examining the test plots with a farmer's practiced eye, nodded appreciatively at the drought-resistant corn's deep root system. "We've had 3 bad years running with the new commercial hybrids," he admitted. "Might be time to try something different, even if it means adjusting our equipment and methods." By late afternoon, what Eliza had expected to be a small volunteer session had transformed into a community consultation. Local expertise emerged from unexpected quarters. A retired engineer offered to help adapt Jacob's irrigation designs to modern materials. A carpenter with historical restoration experience volunteered guidance on the greenhouse construction. Several families committed to regular volunteer hours for the more labor-intensive aspects of the heritage farming methods. "This is how farming communities used to function," observed Eleanor Hayes, watching the spontaneous collaboration with satisfaction. "Knowledge and labor shared for collective benefit." Jacob would have appreciated the irony, his forward-looking methods reviving traditional community practices. The most surprising development came from Harold Wilson. After lengthy examination of the soil conservation techniques detailed in Jacob's journals, he approached Eliza with an unexpected proposal. "That western field of mine that borders your," Property. It's been underperforming for years, he said, his weathered face serious. I'd like to implement some of these methods there. Maybe plant some of those heritage seed varieties if you're willing to share. Could serve as an extension of your test plots. Give us more data on different soil conditions. This offer represented a significant shift. Harold was a respected figure in the local agricultural community, known for his traditional approach and initial skepticism about newfangled farming methods. His willingness to experiment would influence other farmers far more effectively than academic endorsements or Eliza's advocacy alone. As the impromptu gathering dispersed in the early evening, Eliza found herself surrounded by a network of support that hadn't existed that morning. Volunteer schedules had been arranged, expertise had been offered, and most importantly, Jacob's innovations were beginning to be viewed not as historical curiosities, but as practical solutions to present challenges. "You've got something special here," Carol Winters told her as they reviewed the greenhouse plans one final time. "It's not just the technical innovations, it's the story. People connect with the idea of a farmer from the past reaching forward to help his descendants. It gives these adaptations meaning beyond mere functionality." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Eliza sat on the porch steps looking toward the oak tree, silhouetted against the night sky. The day's events had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of Jacob's legacy. What she had, initially seen as a private family inheritance, was revealing itself as something meant for broader sharing. A passage from one of Jacob's later journals came to mind, written in his increasingly shaky handwriting as his health failed. "Knowledge, kept private withers like crops unharvested. The true value of these observations will be realized only when they take root in the wider community, adapting and evolving beyond what I could accomplish alone." For the first time since discovering the metal container, Eliza felt the tension. In her shoulders eased slightly. Jacob hadn't intended her to bear the full responsibility of implementing his vision single-handedly. He had planted seeds meant to grow beyond the boundaries of the Collins farm, seeds that were now beginning to germinate in the wider community. As if affirming this realization, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree, creating a subtle rustling that sounded almost like approving whispers in the darkness. Eliza smiled, recognizing that the next phase of honoring Jacob's legacy would involve not just implementing his methods, but sharing them in ways that could benefit the broader agricultural community. "We're getting there, great-great-grandpa," she said softly to the night air. "Not quite how you might have imagined it, but we're getting there." The momentum generated by the community gathering carried the Collins farm through the challenging summer months. What had begun as a family's desperate attempt to save their heritage evolved into a collaborative initiative that attracted increasing attention both locally and beyond. Construction on the first greenhouse began in early June, its unusual design drawing curious onlookers from throughout the county. Howard Mercer oversaw the project, carefully balancing Jacob's original concepts with modern building standards. The semi-subterranean structure, with its curved living roof and precisely oriented glass panels, took shape gradually. Its purpose, not immediately obvious to casual observers. "Doesn't look like any greenhouse I've ever seen," remarked one delivery driver, watching as volunteers positioned thermal mass water tanks along the northern interior wall. "That's rather the point," Howard replied with a slight smile. "It's designed not to need the constant energy input of conventional greenhouses. The earth berms and water tanks store heat during the day and release it at night, while these venting systems provide passive cooling during peak summer temperatures." The practical implementation of Jacob's designs revealed both the brilliance of his foresight and the challenges of adapting century-old concepts to modern reality. Some elements required significant modification, while others worked precisely. as he had predicted, sometimes to the surprise of the engineers and builders involved. He calculated the solar angles with remarkable precision, Carol Winters noted, checking measurements against Jacob's original sketches. Even accounting for slight shifts in seasonal patterns over the past century, his passive heating calculations are nearly perfect for our current conditions. By mid-July, the first greenhouse was operational, and Eliza began transplanting selected heritage crops into the controlled environment. The results were immediate and compelling. Plants that had struggled in the test plots thrived in the specialized growing conditions, displaying vigor that impressed even Dr. Hayes and her research team. The integration of temperature regulation, water conservation, and soil composition is beautifully balanced, Dr. Hayes observed, examining robust tomato plants that showed none of the heat stress affecting conventional varieties in outdoor fields. He designed this entire system to work holistically. The aquifer development progressed simultaneously, with Michael supervising the installation of Jacob's innovative collection and distribution system. Unlike conventional wells that risked depleting groundwater, Jacob had designed a gravity-assisted collection method that captured only the natural overflow from the aquifer, ensuring sustainable usage without compromising the water table. Most modern systems extract water faster than nature replenishes it, Michael explained to a group of visiting agricultural students. Jacob's approach works with the natural recharge rate instead of against it. It yields less volume in the short term, but maintains consistent supply indefinitely. As impressive as the technical achievements were, Eliza found herself increasingly focused on the human dimension of the project. The struggling farm that had barely supported her family was transforming into a hub of community engagement and practical education. Local farmers who had initially viewed the Collins Farm Heritage Project with skepticism began implementing modified versions of Jacob's methods on their own land, often consulting Eliza and the growing team of volunteers for guidance. Mason and Lily thrived amid the activity, developing their own areas of expertise. Mason showed a particular aptitude for the water management systems, spending hours with Michael learning the principles of hydrology and helping monitor the newly installed collection points. Lily, meanwhile, had become the farm's unofficial historian, meticulously documenting the implementation process and comparing current results with Jacob's predictions. Great-great-grandpa said these tomatoes would be ready 2 weeks earlier than regular varieties, she noted in her journal, unconsciously mimicking Jacob's precise documentation style. They're actually ready 12 days earlier. That's 86% accurate. The children's involvement highlighted a dimension of Jacob's legacy that Eliza hadn't initially appreciated, its educational value. The Collins farm was becoming a living classroom, where abstract concepts like climate adaptation, sustainable agriculture, and water conservation became tangible and practical. This educational potential attracted attention beyond the local community. In early August, representatives from the State University's outreach program visited to discuss developing formal educational materials based on the Collins Farm model. Shortly thereafter, a regional agricultural sustainability network proposed featuring the farm on their annual tour. What you're doing here bridges the gap between academic research and practical farming, explained Diane Torres, the outreach program director. It makes climate-adaptive agriculture accessible to conventional farmers in ways our theoretical programs haven't achieved. The expanding scope of the project brought both opportunities and complications. Each new partnership required time for meetings, documentation, and coordination that stretched Eliza's capacity. The growing public interest, while validating, sometimes interfered with the actual work of implementing Jacob's innovations. We need to balance sharing this knowledge with actually putting it into practice, Eliza confided to Dr. Hayes after a particularly overwhelming week of visitor groups. Sometimes I feel like we're becoming more of a demonstration project than a working farm. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. That tension is inevitable when you're pioneering something with broader implications. But remember that Jacob's ultimate goal wasn't just to save this specific piece of land. It was to develop adaptations that could help agriculture navigate changing conditions. That knowledge benefits no one if it stays within these boundaries. This perspective helped Eliza adjust her expectations and approach. Rather than seeing the educational aspects as distractions from the real work of farming, she began integrating them into the farm's operational model. Visitor groups were scheduled during natural breaks in the agricultural cycle. Demonstration areas were established separate from production zones. And most importantly, a core team of local volunteers was trained to assist with tours and educational programs, freeing Eliza to focus on implementation. Despite these adaptations, the strain of balancing so many aspects of the growing project took its toll. By late August, exhaustion had become Eliza's constant companion. The financial situation, while improved, remained precarious as they invested heavily in infrastructure that wouldn't yield economic returns until the following growing season. On a particularly difficult evening, after dealing with equipment failures in the irrigation system and a miscommunication with a supplier that delayed completion of the second greenhouse, Eliza retreated to the oak tree on the eastern hill. Sitting with her back against its sturdy trunk, she pulled out one of Jacob's journals, seeking guidance across the decades. Flipping through pages of precise observations and technical drawings, she found an entry from 1975, written when Jacob was facing his own health challenges and concerns about the farm's future. There are days when the weight of foresight feels more burden than blessing. To see what's coming and prepare accordingly requires resources beyond the physical. It demands emotional stamina that sometimes falters. I remind myself that no meaningful change follows a straight path. Adaptability isn't just a principle for crops, but for those who tend them. The capacity to adjust course while maintaining direction may be the most essential skill for navigating uncertain futures. The simplicity and directness of Jacob's words, his acknowledgement of struggle while maintaining commitment to his larger vision, provided exactly the perspective Eliza needed. He hadn't expected perfection or immediate success. He had understood that adaptation was a process requiring patience and persistence. As the summer heat began yielding to hints of autumn coolness, the Collins Farm Heritage Project reached a significant milestone. The first harvest from the completed greenhouse produced yields exceeding even Jacob's optimistic projections, with produce quality that attracted premium prices at the local farmers' market. Perhaps more importantly, Harold Wilson's test plot, using Jacob's methods and seed varieties, had demonstrated remarkable resilience during a 2-week drought that stressed conventional crops throughout the region. "Your great-great-granddaddy was onto something," Harold acknowledged, his typical reserve yielding to genuine enthusiasm as they compared his test plot with his traditional fields. These plants didn't just survive, they maintained productivity when everything else was struggling. This practical demonstration, coming from a respected conventional farmer, carried weight that academic endorsements and theoretical projections couldn't match. As word spread among the local agricultural community, the Collins farm began receiving requests for seed stock and implementation guidance that suggested Jacob's innovations were finally taking root beyond the family boundaries. For Eliza, watching this gradual acceptance unfold, there was a sense of coming full circle, of promises kept and faith rewarded across generations. The oak tree continued its silent vigil on the eastern hill, its expanding root system mirroring the widening influence of the farmer who had planted it with such purposeful foresight a century before. The autumn brought dramatic changes to the Collins farm, both in the landscape and in the family's relationship with Jacob's legacy. As the maple trees along the farm's southern boundary blazed with October color, the second greenhouse neared completion, its curved profile and living roof blending harmoniously with the rolling terrain. The first greenhouse, now fully operational for nearly 3 months, continued producing abundantly despite the cooler temperatures, validating Jacob's thermal engineering principles. More significant than the physical structures was the subtle shift in how Eliza and the children had come to view their responsibility to their ancestors' vision. What had begun as a desperate financial salvation had evolved into a family mission that extended beyond mere implementation of Jacob's innovations. "I think we're supposed to continue where he left off, not just follow his instructions," Mason observed one evening as they reviewed the latest journal entries they'd discovered in the metal container. Now 13, he had developed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of Jacob's hydrological systems. Great-great-grandpa didn't know everything about what would happen in our time. He gave us tools to start with, but we need to keep improving them. This insight crystallized something Eliza had been feeling intuitively. That true honor to Jacob's legacy meant extending his work rather than simply preserving it. The most recent sections of his journals revealed that he had anticipated this evolution. "I harbor no illusions that these designs represent perfect solutions," he had written in one of his final entries. "They are merely the best adaptations I can conceive based on limited projections. My hope is that future generations will refine and transcend these initial concepts, developing approaches I cannot even imagine from my vantage point in time." This perspective liberated Eliza from the pressure of exact adherence to Jacob's plans, encouraging creative adaptation to current conditions and emerging challenges. Working with Howard Mercer and Carol Winters, she began modifying the designs for the third greenhouse to incorporate modern materials and construction techniques while maintaining the core passive energy principles. Dr. Hayes supported this evolutionary approach, bringing in additional university researchers to help document both Jacob's original concepts and the Collins family's contemporary adaptations. This collaboration resulted in a formal research partnership that provided much-needed financial support and scientific validation. What makes this project unique is its integration of historical wisdom with contemporary science, Dr. Hayes explained to the university regents during a site visit in late October. "We're not simply implementing century-old designs. We're using them as foundational principles for developing next-generation sustainable agricultural systems." The research partnership attracted attention from beyond the academic community. In early November, a representative from the Regional Climate Resilience Coalition visited the farm to assess its potential as a demonstration site for adaptive agricultural practices. Impressed by both the technical innovations and the compelling narrative of intergenerational foresight, the coalition offered a substantial development grant to expand the project's educational outreach. "Your family story resonates far beyond the specific agricultural techniques," explained Regina Ortiz, the coalition's program director. "It provides a powerful framework for discussing long-term thinking and intergenerational responsibility in ways that abstract climate policies cannot." This growing recognition brought both opportunities and new pressures. The financial situation had stabilized, but the expansion of the project's scope required organizational structures beyond what a single family could manage. After lengthy consultation with Michael, Dr. Hayes, and other key advisors, Eliza decided to establish the Collins Agricultural Heritage Foundation, a non-profit entity that would oversee the growing educational and research components while allowing the family to maintain control of the working farm. This structure gives us the best of both worlds, Michael explained during a family meeting where they discussed the foundation concept. The non-profit can accept grants, coordinate research, and manage public outreach, while you maintain the actual farming operation as a separate entity that can implement and test the innovations in real-world conditions. The children embraced the foundation concept with enthusiasm, particularly when Eliza explained that it would ensure the continuity of Jacob's legacy beyond their lifetime. Lily immediately volunteered to design a logo, while Mason began sketching ideas for educational displays that would help visitors understand the water management systems. As preparations for the foundation's formal establishment progressed, an unexpected discovery in Jacob's materials added a new dimension to the project. Among the sealed packets in the metal container, Eliza found a collection of correspondence between Jacob and agricultural specialists across the country, revealing a network of like-minded observers who had been sharing climate observations and adaptation strategies since the 1950s. He wasn't working in isolation, Eliza realized as she read through the letters. There were others noticing the same patterns, developing their own responses based on local conditions. Jacob was part of an informal network of forward-thinking farmers and researchers that history has largely forgotten. This revelation prompted Dr. Hayes to initiate a research project tracing this network and its influence on agricultural practices across regions. Preliminary investigations identified several farms in different states where similar long-term observations had been conducted, though none appeared to have preserved their findings as meticulously as Jacob had. We may be uncovering an undocumented movement of climate-aware agriculturalists who were decades ahead of institutional science, Dr. Hayes explained, her academic excitement palpable. These correspondence networks suggest a grassroots adaptation response that occurred well before formal climate science emerged as a discipline. For Eliza, this discovery reinforced the broader significance of what had initially seemed a personal family legacy. Jacob hadn't simply been an isolated visionary. He had been part of a larger, albeit informal movement of practical observers, responding to environmental changes they witnessed firsthand. This context added historical importance to the Collins Farm project, positioning it as the rediscovery of lost knowledge rather than merely the implementation of one farmer's innovations. As November progressed and the landscape prepared for winter dormancy, the Collins family reached a symbolic milestone in their journey with Jacob's legacy. The conservation easement that protected the aquifer was formally registered, ensuring that this vital water resource would remain protected in perpetuity regardless of the farm's future ownership. A simple ceremony marked the occasion, attended by local officials, community supporters, and representatives from the environmental agency. Standing beside the ancient oak tree, now bare of leaves but majestic in its winter silhouette, Eliza felt a profound sense of accomplishment that transcended the immediate project successes. They had not only honored Jacob's specific request, but had expanded its purpose in ways that connected past, present, and future in a continuous thread of stewardship. My great-great-grandfather planted this oak a century ago as a living timekeeper, she told the small gathering. He understood something that we're only beginning to fully appreciate, that caring for the land requires thinking beyond our own lifetimes. The easement we're establishing today continues that tradition, protecting this water source not just for our use, but for generations yet to come. The children stood beside her, unusually solemn as the significance of the moment registered even with their young minds. Mason had polished the small brass plaque they would affix to a stone near the oak tree, commemorating both Jacob's foresight and the community's commitment to continuing his work. As the brief ceremony concluded and the visitors dispersed, the Collins family remained by the oak tree, absorbed in their own reflections. Lily placed her hand against the rough bark, as if trying to communicate across time with the man who had planted it. "Do you think he knows?" she asked softly. "Great-great-grandpa. Jacob, do you think he somehow knows what we've done?" Eliza considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "I don't know if he knows in the way you mean," she answered carefully. "But I think he trusted that someday someone would understand what he was trying to preserve and would carry it forward. In that sense, maybe he does know, not the specific details, but that his faith in future generations was justified." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, where foundation planning documents awaited final review, Eliza reflected on how dramatically their circumstances had changed in the months since they'd first unearthed the metal container beneath the oak. The farm that had teetered on the edge of foreclosure was now becoming a center for innovation and education, its future more secure than it had been in decades. Yet the most profound change was less tangible. It was the family's understanding of their place in a continuum of stewardship that extended both backward and forward in time. Jacob's legacy wasn't simply the physical innovations or even the farm itself. It was this awareness of responsibility to past wisdom and future needs that transcended immediate concerns. As winter settled over the Collins farm, preparations continued for the foundation's launch in the spring, a rebirth appropriately timed to coincide with the centennial of the oak tree's planting. The dormant season provided space for planning and reflection, for integrating the lessons of the past year and envisioning the path forward. In the quiet evenings, Eliza often found herself returning to Jacob's journals, not seeking specific, technical guidance now, but absorbing the philosophy that had informed his life's work. Between detailed weather observations and crop yield calculations, glimpses of his deeper motivation emerged. "We are but temporary caretakers," he had written, "entrusted with land that existed long before us and will continue long after. True stewardship lies not in extraction, but in enhancement, leaving one's fields more abundant, one's soil more alive, one's waters more pure than when they were received. This is the only meaningful inheritance we can offer those who will follow us." The winter months, traditionally a quieter season on Pennsylvania farms, became a period of intense preparation at the Collins farm. Inside the warm farmhouse, as snow blanketed the fields and the oak tree stood stark against grey skies, Eliza and a growing team of collaborators developed the formal structure and initial programs for the Collins Agricultural Heritage Foundation. "We need to balance academic research with practical application," Eliza insisted during planning sessions that often stretched into the evening hours. Jacob's innovations weren't theoretical, they were meant to be implemented by working farmers facing real challenges. This practical emphasis shaped the Foundation's emerging mission to translate climate-adaptive agricultural knowledge into accessible formats that conventional farmers could implement incrementally without requiring radical changes to their operations or prohibitive investments. Dr. Hayes and her team focused on documenting and validating Jacob's methods through scientific research, while Howard Mercer and Carol Winters continued refining the structural designs to make them more affordable and adaptable to existing farm infrastructures. Michael worked with state water authorities to develop replicable models of Jacob's aquifer management system that could be applied to various hydrogeological conditions. The children contributed their unique perspectives to the planning process. Mason had become surprisingly adept at simplifying complex hydrological concepts for general audiences, developing clear visual explanations that even elementary school students could grasp. Lily's meticulous documentation of the family's journey, including photographs, journal entries, and pressed specimens from the heritage crops, provided compelling narrative elements for the Foundation's educational materials. People remember stories better than facts, she explained with the straightforward wisdom of a 10-year-old. If we want them to understand great-great-grandpa Jacob's methods, we need to tell his story along with the science. By January, the IG Foundation's structure had taken shape. It would include a research component, partnered with the university, an education program offering workshops and demonstrations for farmers and students, and a seed preservation initiative to maintain and distribute Jacob's heritage varieties. The working farm would serve as both testing ground and demonstration site, implementing new adaptations while showcasing proven methods. Financial sustainability remained a primary concern. While grants and research partnerships provided initial funding, Eliza was determined that the foundation develop revenue streams that would ensure its long-term viability. After consulting with agricultural business specialists, they developed a three-pronged approach: premium pricing for heritage produce and seeds, licensing fees for certain technical innovations, and structured educational programs that could generate tuition revenue. Jacob didn't just want us to survive. He wanted us to thrive while helping others adapt, Eliza explained to potential board members. Financial sustainability is essential to fulfilling that mission over generations. As February arrived with its characteristic bitter cold, unexpected validation of Jacob's foresight came from current climate conditions. The winter had brought erratic temperature swings rather than consistent cold, precisely the pattern Jacob had predicted would become normalized by the 2020s. These fluctuations stressed conventional winter crops and dormant perennials, while the varieties Jacob had developed specifically for these conditions showed remarkable resilience. It's almost unsettling how accurately he anticipated these patterns, remarked Harold Wilson during a meeting of local farmers who had gathered to learn about cold weather adaptations. Makes you wonder what else he got right about what's coming. This growing recognition of Jacob's predictive accuracy lent additional credibility to the adaptation strategies he had developed. Farmers who had been skeptical about climate-adaptive agriculture began showing interest in techniques that demonstrated immediate benefits in current conditions rather than abstract future scenarios. By early March, as the first hints of spring brought renewed activity to the land, the Collins Agricultural Heritage Foundation was ready for its formal launch. The timing coincided with the oak tree's centennial, a symbolism that resonated with everyone involved in the project. Invitations were sent to agricultural officials, environmental organizations, local government representatives, and most importantly, farming families throughout the region. The oak tree itself, now beginning its 100th year of growth, had become something of a local landmark. Visitors to the farm invariably wanted to see the tree that started it all, often placing their hands on its rough bark, as if trying to connect with the farmer who had planted it with such purposeful foresight. For the Collins family, the approaching foundation launch represented more than organizational development. It marked a transformation in their relationship with the land and with Jacob's legacy. What had begun as a desperate search for financial salvation had evolved into a multi-generational commitment to agricultural stewardship and climate resilience. I wonder what great-great-grandpa Jacob would think of all this, Mason mused one evening as they reviewed the final preparations for the launch event. Do you think this is what he expected when he buried his research under the oak tree? Eliza considered the question thoughtfully. I think he hoped for something like this, but couldn't know exactly what form it would take. That's the nature of planting seeds for the future. You create potential without controlling exactly how it grows. As the centennial of the oak tree's planting approached, the Collins family prepared to honor not just Jacob's specific innovations, but the spirit of foresight and commitment to future generations that had motivated his unusual request. The oak's branches, now showing the first swelling buds of spring, reached upward against the clearing sky, a living monument to patience, perseverance, and the profound connection between past wisdom and future flourishing. The morning of the Foundation's launch dawned clear and unseasonably warm, as if nature itself approved of the occasion. March 21st, 2023. Exactly 100 years since Jacob Collins had planted the oak sapling on the eastern hill. The farm had been meticulously prepared for the event, with guided tour routes marked through the experimental fields, information stations set up to explain various innovations, and the completed greenhouses polished to showcase their unique design features. The simple metal sign at the farm entrance had been replaced with a more substantial marker: Collins Agricultural Heritage Farm, cultivating resilience since 1923. Beneath the new sign hung a smaller placard with Jacob's words from his journal: "We farm not merely for this season, but for seasons beyond our knowing." By mid-morning, vehicles began arriving. First the event volunteers and foundation board members, then a steady stream of visitors ranging from local farmers to university researchers, government officials to curious community members. The attendance exceeded Eliza's expectations, with over 200 people gathering to witness the official launch. The central ceremony would take place, fittingly, beneath the oak tree. Chairs had been arranged in concentric circles around its massive trunk, with a simple podium positioned where everyone could see both the speaker and the tree that had started their journey. "I never expected this many people would care about an old farmer's ideas," Eliza confided to Dr. Hayes as they watched the gathering crowd from the farmhouse porch. "That's because it's not just about farming techniques," the professor replied. "This speaks to something deeper, our relationship with time, with future generations, with the land itself." Jacob understood that agriculture isn't simply about production. It's about stewardship. As noon approached, the assembled guests took their seats beneath the oak's spreading branches. Mason and Lily, dressed in their best clothes and visibly proud of their role, escorted distinguished visitors to reserve seats in the front row. The metal container that had held Jacob's materials was displayed on a small table beside the podium, alongside several of his leather-bound journals open to significant pages. The formal program began with Dr. Hayes providing historical context for Jacob's work, followed by technical presentations from Howard Mercer and Michael regarding the implemented innovations. Several local farmers, including Harold Wilson, shared their experiences adopting modified versions of Jacob's methods on their own land. Throughout these presentations, the oak tree stood as a silent witness, its first spring leaves beginning to unfurl in the warm March sunlight. For many attendees, this living connection to Jacob Collins, the tree he had planted with his own hands a century earlier, provided emotional resonance beyond the technical and scientific achievements being celebrated. When Eliza finally approached the podium, the assembled crowd fell silent. Unlike the previous speakers who had focused on specific aspects of the project, her role was to articulate the larger vision that would guide the Foundation's work in the years ahead. "My great-great-grandfather planted this oak, not knowing if his descendants would honor his request," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "He couldn't know our names or faces, couldn't know the specific challenges we would face. Yet, he acted with care for our well-being across a century of change." A gentle breeze stirred the oak's branches, sending dappled shadows dancing across the gathering. Today, we honor not just his foresight, but his fundamental understanding that true stewardship extends beyond our own lifetimes. The Collins Agricultural Heritage Foundation will continue this tradition, developing and sharing agricultural practices that look not just to the next harvest, but to harvests beyond our knowing. Eliza continued her address, her confidence growing as she spoke. "The challenges facing agriculture today are not simple nor are they short-term. Climate unpredictability, water scarcity, soil degradation, these are multi-generational problems requiring multi-generational solutions. She gestured toward the metal container that had transformed their lives. Jacob Collins understood this fundamental truth in 1978 when he buried his life's work beneath this oak. He knew that the adaptations he'd developed would be needed not in his time, but in ours. That same perspective must guide our work moving forward. As Eliza outlined the Foundation's three core missions, research, education, and implementation, the audience's attention remained fixed not just on her words, but on the incredible story they represented. The narrative of an early 20th century farmer with the foresight to develop climate-adaptive agricultural methods decades before climate science emerged as a discipline had captivated imaginations far beyond what the Collins family had anticipated. We will continue to study and refine the methods Jacob developed, Eliza explained. But perhaps more importantly, we will extend his approach. Careful observation, methodical documentation, and long-term thinking to address challenges he couldn't have foreseen. The formal ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a modest memorial stone at the base of the oak tree. Unlike traditional monuments that looked backward, celebrating past achievements, the simple inscription faced forward. Planted 1923 by Jacob Collins, who saw beyond his horizon. May those who rest in this shade continue to look outward. Following the ceremony, attendees dispersed throughout the farm to observe the practical implementations of Jacob's innovations. The completed greenhouses drew particular interest, their elegant functionality demonstrating how principles developed a century earlier could be enhanced with modern materials and technology. Mason led tours of the water management system, explaining with remarkable clarity how the sustainable aquifer access worked in harmony with natural recharge rates. Lily stationed herself beside displays of heritage seed varieties, sharing her great-great-grandfather's notes on their specific adaptations to changing climate conditions. As the afternoon progressed, the event evolved from formal launch to collaborative exchange. Farmers shared their own observations of changing conditions with researchers. Engineers and architects discussed modifications to Jacob's designs that might make them more accessible for different scales of agricultural operation. Seed preservation. Specialists examined the heritage varieties, making arrangements to include them in regional seed banks. For Eliza, watching these spontaneous collaborations unfold, the day represented far more than organizational achievement. The metal container unearthed beneath the oak had yielded not just practical innovations, but a profound shift in how people conceptualized their relationship with land and time. "Your father would be proud," Harold Wilson told her as the event wound down, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the farm. "Not just of what you've done with the place, but how you've honored the old man's vision while making it your own." This observation captured something essential about the Collins family's journey with Jacob's legacy. They had moved beyond simply implementing his specific instructions to embracing the underlying philosophy that had guided his work. The recognition that sustainable agriculture required thinking across generational boundaries. As the last visitors departed and the family gathered on the farmhouse porch, the oak tree stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its first century complete, its second just beginning. Like the foundation launched in its shadow, the tree embodied continuity between past wisdom and future possibility. "What next?" Mason asked, the question containing both weariness from the day's events and genuine curiosity about the path ahead. Eliza smiled, watching the last light gild the oak's uppermost branches. "We keep growing," she said simply, just like great-great-grandpa Jacob knew we would. The months following the foundation launch brought a whirlwind of activity to the Collins farm. Spring plantings implemented Jacob's seasonal timing recommendations, which proved remarkably aligned with the unpredictable weather patterns that characterized that year. The heritage seed varieties, now growing in carefully monitored test plots across the region, demonstrated superior resilience to the temperature, fluctuations and erratic rainfall that challenged conventional crops. Media attention, initially local, expanded to include regional agricultural publications and eventually national outlets interested in climate adaptation strategies. A prominent farming magazine featured the Collins Agricultural Heritage Foundation. In its June issue, with the ancient oak tree on the cover and the headline, "A Century of Foresight, How One Farmer's Legacy is Reshaping Agricultural Adaptation." This publicity brought new challenges. Requests for tours, consultations, and speaking engagements poured in faster than the small foundation staff could manage. Seed requests for Jacob's heritage varieties exceeded their limited supply, requiring careful decisions about distribution priorities. "We need to scale thoughtfully," Eliza reminded the foundation board during their June meeting. Jacob's approach was never about rapid expansion, but about sustainable growth that maintains quality and integrity. This philosophy guided their development strategy. Rather than attempting to serve all interested parties immediately, they established a phased approach, focusing first on regional implementation, where direct oversight and support could maintain fidelity to Jacob's methods. Partnership farms were carefully selected based on commitment to the underlying principles rather than mere interest in the techniques. The Collins children found themselves unexpectedly at the center of the foundation's narrative power. Mason's straightforward explanations of complex water systems, and Lily's enthusiastic storytelling about their great-great-grandfather resonated with visitors in ways that technical presentations couldn't match. They embodied the intergenerational aspect of Jacob's legacy, demonstrating how foresight from the past was shaping young lives in the present. By midsummer, the first commercial crops from the climate-adaptive greenhouses entered local markets, commanding premium prices for their quality and cultivation story. This revenue stream, modest but growing, validated the foundation's economic sustainability model and provided tangible evidence that climate-adaptive agriculture could be both environmentally responsible and financially viable. Throughout these developments, the oak tree continued its silent vigil on the eastern hill, its spreading canopy now offering shade to visitors who came to learn about the farmer who had planted it with such purposeful foresight. The tree had become more than a biological timekeeper. It was a living symbol of connection between past wisdom and future flourishing, between individual action and collective benefit. The true miracle, Eliza reflected one evening, watching fireflies rise from the fields as darkness settled over the farm, isn't that Jacob predicted climate changes correctly. It's that he cared enough about people he would never meet to spend his life developing solutions for them. As autumn returned to the Collins farm, completing a full year since the discovery beneath the oak tree, the transformation of both the land and the family was undeniable. The once struggling operation had become a model of climate-adaptive agriculture, its fields demonstrating resilience through weather patterns that continued to challenge conventional farms throughout the region. For Eliza, the most meaningful evidence of Jacob's legacy wasn't found in the research statistics or foundation achievements, but in the daily reality of viable, sustainable farming. The property that had nearly slipped away through foreclosure was now productive, profitable, and positioned for long-term stability. More importantly, it had retained its character as a family farm while expanding its purpose to serve broader agricultural adaptation. On the anniversary of their discovery, the Collins family held a private ceremony beneath the oak tree, now in its 101st year of growth. Unlike the foundation launch with its many attendees and formal proceedings, this gathering included only the family and their closest collaborators who had become like extended family through their shared work. "It feels right to mark this day," Eliza said, as they stood in a small circle beneath the oak's branches, now burnished with autumn colors. "1 year ago we were desperate for solutions, hoping against hope that great-great-grandpa Jacob had left something valuable beneath this tree. Little did we know," Michael added with a smile, "that the value would extend far beyond this farm." The children had prepared a simple ceremony. Mason had crafted a small wooden box modeled after the metal container they had unearthed the previous year. Lily had written a letter to future Collins generations, explaining what they had learned and the work they had begun. "We're not burying this under the tree," Lily explained as she placed her letter in the box. "That was great-great-grandpa Jacob's way. This is going in the foundation archives, but we're adding to it every year on this date. It's our way of keeping records for whoever comes after us." Each person added something to the box: photographs, seed samples, notes about the year's challenges and successes. Harold Wilson contributed a soil sample from his test plot, now expanded to cover a significant portion of his farm. Dr. Hayes included summary data from the first year of formal research on Jacob's methods. As the simple ceremony concluded, Eliza placed her hand on the oak's rough bark, feeling the connection to the man who had planted it with such purpose a century earlier. "We found your treasure, Jacob," she said softly. "Not just what you buried, but what you understood, that caring for the land means caring for those who will inherit it long after we're gone." The oak's remaining leaves rustled in the autumn breeze, a whispered response across time that everyone present felt, but no one needed to articulate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.